All right. Hare Krishna. Welcome to the weekly Wednesday class. We will get started with Mangalacharna and then we'll get into it. Mm.
Just a minute. Ah, it is not going down. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Just a minute, let me something going on.
No problem.
PDF. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Prabhu. Om Jnana Timirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vancha kalpa tarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. I'll be speaking on the topic of free will, agency, and selfhood. And it's based on a book by Advaita Prabhu, who is a professor of Indology and religion at Rutgers University. And he's the editor of this book. So he's talking about many different Indian philosophies, um, and what they think about free will, this idea of like agency and the idea of the self. How does everyone define it? What differs between all of them? And I mainly want to focus on our Gaudiya version of that, where we talk about what is free will for us, what is agency, what is the definition of selfhood. And so the verse that I've picked for this, the Bhagavad Gita verse, is chapter 3, text 27. And it's a very interesting verse because it brings up a very just a very weird point, or not weird, but just a very thought-provoking point. And so 327 goes like this: Prakrite kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvasha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. Translation: The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. Purport: Two persons, one in Krishna consciousness and the other in material consciousness, working on the same level, may appear to be working on the same platform, but there is a wide gulf of difference in their respective positions. The person in material consciousness is convinced by a false ego that he is a doer of everything. He does not know that the mechanism of the body is produced by material nature, which works under the supervision of the Supreme Lord. The materialistic person has no knowledge that ultimately he is under the control of Krishna. The person in false ego takes all credit for doing everything independently, and that is the symptom of his nescience. He does not know that this gross and subtle body is the creation of material nature under the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and as such, his bodily and mental activities should be engaged in the service of Krishna in Krishna consciousness. The ignorant man forgets that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is known as Rishikesh, or the master of the senses of the material body. For due to his long misuse of the senses and sense gratification, he is factually bewildered by the false ego, which makes him forget his eternal relationship with Krishna. And so there's a lot going on in this verse. The first thing is the translation. What we can simply infer from what it's saying is that the spirit soul is not the doer of the activities. That's actually carried out by material nature, by prakriti, this technical term for it. But in the purport, it's Srila Prabhupada is clarifying this a little bit more, where all of this is under the jurisdiction of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And even though the spirit soul is not the doer, somehow or other, the soul, which is us, the self, has the ability to turn themselves to Krishna. Where Prabhupada says here that they forget Krishna. And so clearly we're able to do something. We're able to forget Krishna, and we're also able to apparently remember Krishna. And so it seems like we are the doer in some ways, but then this translation says that we're not the doer. And so the idea is to reconcile this. And so what does it actually mean to be a spirit soul? And how does that connect with the actions that we seem to be taking that are apparently not done by us, that are actually not carried out by us? And so to truly understand this, I want to go over some definitions. I'll stop sharing this and I'll just be speaking. Um, Feel free to ask any questions along the way. And so when we talk about this idea of free will, what can we actually do? We start with will. What does will mean? Will is the capacity to choose certain courses of action. And so it's the Sanskrit word for it is like chikirsha, which is the desire to act. And it's analogous to will, which is just to choose certain courses of action. And then free will is understood as one's ability to choose these actions, or also in terms of someone being the proper source of their choice. And so another term that kind of is very similar to this is called swatantriya, which is independence. And this is like a good approximation of what we try to refer to as free will in the Western sense. And so it's basically the capacity for self-determined action. And so why is this important? Free will is important because it's a necessary condition for moral responsibility. If you don't have free will, how can you be held responsible for your actions? If it was never if you never had the capacity to make a choice. And so this is also very important when we talk about human goals and achievements. Do we have the ability to freely direct ourselves to some desired accomplishment or objective that we have? And so free will is very important in these two ways. First of all, moral responsibility, and then secondly, achieving something. Then another term that I'm going to bring up is an agent. An agent is someone or something that performs actions. That's all. An agency is the capacity to perform these actions. And that's captured by the Sanskrit term of kartritva. Essentially someone, or not someone, but the capacity itself to perform those actions. And the agent or the kartra is someone that does perform those actions. And so an example just to encapsulate all these definitions is like there's a stone rolling down a hill that produces a bunch of chain events that chain events, like let's say it splashes into a lake, whatnot. That does not constitute action in the sense of a manifestation of agency. Rather, a person jumping into a lake is an action, as there's a source to that action, which is the person or this agent of a person. And so a question might come, do only humans carry agency? Because that's a very natural example. We talk about humans when we make these examples. But full-blooded agency actually requires rationality and the capacity for reflection and choice. Because how can you really be an agent or have agency if you don't have capacity to reflect and choose? And so humans have the ability to intentionally produce outcomes that we select worthy according to our values or our desires. So we're able to intentionally produce outcomes um, because we have agency in this sense. But then again, do we really have agency? When we think about our scriptures and so on, there's a lot of statements that tell us that we're not in control, that we're not the doer. And so, what we're going to go into today is really understand this idea of agency. Another term is selfhood, which is kind of well defined in every kind of philosophical thought, especially in Indian philosophy. And the Sanskrit term for self is Atman, um, and an initial approximation is that selfhood is a condition of being a kind of location of all our psychological states. It's like the place where the mind happens. That's what our self is. It's where our thoughts happen, where our emotions happen, and so on. If we think about consciousness, selfhood can also be defined in that way, where it's like a fundamental unit of consciousness. And so this this version of selfhood where it's like this place of the mind is considered superficial for some schools, especially like in the Gaudiya Vaishnava school, where there's actually a deeper self that transcends this like version of the false ego. And so the Indian context that we can bring into this with these definitions is that there's this idea of karma, in and this is important when we talk about free will, agency, and so on, because there's a way in which small decisions that we've made collectively form our character and also our future self. And this is very intuitive. Things that you do today have consequences. That's essentially what it's saying. Um, but there's many ways you can kind of take this. So one way to take it is that human effort is absolutely useless. That fate rules all our lives. We are destined to suffer and enjoy according to whatever we're allotted by our karma. This whatever momentum we've got, whatever is predestined for us, that is what we're going to suffer and enjoy. All our own effort is completely useless. This is one way of thinking about karma. The other one, like with Buddhism and Jainism, they condemn this and they emphasize personal effort in the pursuit of some supreme good. And so there's a massive emphasis on actually doing work and acting on your own. But everyone agrees that one's decisions and actions create some kind of momentum. So it may not be like fully predetermined, but there's some momentum that continues after death and into one's next life and so on. And there are consequences that may unfold over many different bodies. And so this karmic inheritance, as we may call it, determines the range of options one may have in their life. And so the real question now is, what is the role of human effort in light of all this past weight that we may carry? And then also our current relationships. And how do they impact our individual agency? Again, agency is the ability to act in this sense. And so the question that I want to ask all of you is, where is the seat of human willing and the origin of human action? So where do we will from? And then where does our human action start from? What is the beginning of that? And so I'm going to first go over some Western ideas about this, the Greeks, and then of course more the Christian thinkers, and then what we think in modern times. And then I'll go into the Vedic side of it, specifically looking at the Gaudiya Vaishnava side of it. And so Plato, one of the ancient Greeks, what he said is that true autonomy, or in this case, like independence, free will, so on, he says that it requires an understanding of the good. and with a corresponding rational control over one's desires and actions, um, we can only have true autonomy. And so the best life, in his opinion, is governed by this idea of reflective knowledge of what is good. And the example he would give is that those in political power were actually not very independent, as they may look, because they were slaves of their own passions and desires. They were incapable of actually achieving what they wanted. Um, and that is different from someone who understood what was good, and they were actually free and autonomous because they could achieve their goals. And what plays with this is Socrates, I think it's called Olympus or Olynthus. I don't know the exact way to pronounce it, but it's this idea of asking lots of questions. The Socratic method, as many say right now, where you ask a lot of questions and you gain this reflective knowledge and you earn it by directly asking questions. And so this is the ancient Greek kind of method of understanding autonomy. Aristotle then studied what undermines human autonomy, what limits it. And what he said is that the origin of action is external to the individual. For example, when one is deceived, someone cheats you, someone scams you, we actually act unwittingly in a way that we would avoid to do if we were fully knowledgeable. And so the individual is turned into some kind of instrument of some external agent. And so one can say this is an undermining of our free will or our autonomy because the origin of the action is not just not within us. It's coming from some external source, some scammer, someone trying to cheat us, and so on. So that's one type of lack of autonomy. The other type of lack of autonomy is self-caused. For example, someone's character inclines them to vice, like a drunken man. Someone who's drunk is going to make mistakes. Is that necessarily something they would do if they were fully knowledgeable? No. But the reason they're drunk is because they chose to be drunk. And so it's self-caused lack of autonomy. And so this person is not necessarily free of blame, just because they are limited in their free will, because that's of their own doing. And then the medieval thinkers, these are more the Christians, it became more related to God. And so Augustine, he assigned all responsibility to humans. Essentially, everything is because you chose to do it. Everything is your responsibility. All your actions are your responsibility. But God is off the hook. So whatever God does is not necessarily his responsibility. And so whatever you do is. A question that comes out of this is God is omniscient. So when we introduce God, things come into there are different things that come into play. First of all, God is omniscient. So how do we have free will? If he knows everything, he knows the future, he knows the past, he knows the present. How do I have free will if he knows what I'm going to do tomorrow? And the way the Christians reconcile this was our free choices take place within time, and God is outside of time. And so God's existence is not necessarily confined to today or tomorrow, and his knowledge is not necessarily foreknowledge or this knowledge of the future. His knowledge is a simultaneous, immediate awareness of everything, but it's an immediate awareness and it's simultaneous. So it's fully omniscient in that sense, but it's not like God knows the future or has a knowledge of what will happen in the future. And so that this was kind of the way they reconciled this idea of how God plays into free will. Another thing they mentioned was that will is rational appetite. And so will can also be a motivation for goal-directed action. And that this is another kind of thing that comes in related to goal setting and achieving goals with our will. In the more modern period, early modern period, the world is more thought of a causally determined world. A sequence of events have led us to where we are. And humans, as a part of nature, are also completely causal. And so, how can we have autonomy? It's kind of this idea of a simulation. Things are just happening because there are rules in place. If I move my hand, hit a wall, it hurts. These are the rules in place. There's cause and effect for every single thing. And so, it fully embraces this idea of determinism, where all events are ultimately determined by the causes. And these causes are external to our will. And so, the idea of freedom now becomes a little different. Some said freedom means simply the freedom of physical movement, so lack of impediments. Some said that the conception of freedom is just a pure illusion. So there is some freedom in accepting our complete conditioning. So if you accept your illusion, your illusory state, that is your freedom. Um, Oliver Kant, he introduced two realms, in fact, the phenomenal realm, which is the material kind of space, and then he also introduced a spiritual, numinous realm, which allows for free will on a numinal perspective, but our world here, what we can physically see and experience, is still fully deterministic. And now, in the modern period where we are right now, there's really three ways of thinking about free will. One is, of course, the deterministic method, as I just said. Um, some other thoughts on that are the compatibilist method, which uh, tries to work with determinism, but it says that there's also some free will with it. So some free will is compatible with determinism, and so they both exist, and there's basically moral responsibility for action. And so, like whatever actions you do take, you do hold responsible for them. And then something that's getting more popular nowadays is libertarianism, which is to deny complete determinism. Everyone has full free will to do anything you want. There's nothing hindering you. And so these are kind of how we think about it in the modern period. In terms of the Indian schools of thought, there are so many, and every single one of them thinks of them slightly differently. This is not a major point of contention. Uh, Thousands of years ago, no one was debating what kind of free will each school of thought allowed you, because it was thought of like on a very intuitive level. Um, but they do differ in their versions of how they define free will, agency, and so on. And so I'll just cover three of them. The Sankhya philosophy basically says its main axiom or its foundational thought is that everything is changeless. And so nothing changes. Everything that does not change, as they say, is eternal. So this is another axiom. Anything that doesn't change is eternal. Everything that changes is not eternal. And so that's how the the Sankhya philosophy goes about describing their axioms. And then what this introduces is that we are not necessarily changeless. Our self, let's say, is defined as changeless in Sankhya, but our emotions, our feelings, our desires, our knowledge, all of that changes. And so, what are these fluctuating features of our own person? And so, what Sankhya says is that that's all part of our material covering. And so, the deep self, who we actually are, is entirely devoid of agency and will. That's all in our mind. All our agency and will is in our mind. And our deep self is completely devoid of that. There is no agency, there's no willing in our actual self. And another school of thought is the grammar school of thought, Panini, where essentially the way they analyze agency is through sentences and grammar, where there is someone that is doing the action, there's the object, there's a subject, there's a verb, and so on. And so that's how they analyze agency. And what they essentially say is that the agent has to be independent. And so there are like category names for different participants in the action. And so one category name is called the agent, and that's the kartra, which is independent. Um, for example, when cooking rice, many participants are contributing to cooking the rice. There's the rice, there's the wood, there's the pot, etc. But the cook is the agent proper or the independent participant who manages everything else. And so this is the grammar school of thought for agency, where it's the independent participant. And so the best examples are persons, but they can actually also be non-sentient entities from a sentence structure perspective. If we were to say the river flows, the river is the agent here, essentially, because it works in the sentence. And so that's the grammar school of thought. And then there's another one that kind of goes against Sankhya, where Sankhya says the self has no agency, no will, nothing. It is just changeless and empty. Nyaya says that the self is a substance that has two things. It is both the substance, which is the self that we know, but it also has a part which has psychological properties. And agency is one of those psychological properties, but it can also be like happiness, distress, desires, and so on. And all of them function independently. And so the self is like this shared location for both the substance of the self and then all these psychological properties. And so the self does participate in this world, essentially. Sankhya says the self does not participate. There's matter that only participates. But in Nyaya, the self does participate in the world, and knowing is also acting. In a weird way, liberation in Nyaya means to get rid of more stuff. So if someone in this world is actually richer in their self than someone who is liberated. And so that's Nyaya. The Gaudiya Vaishnav thought is it comes from both of these Nyaya and Sankhya. It's kind of using those elements to build its own. And so I'm just going to go into Sankhya a little bit more to just dive a little deeper and understand all these different elements and then how that ties into what we know about ourselves. Again, the reason why this is very interesting and important is because it allows us to do two things. First, understand our own moral responsibility. And then secondly, how do we actually achieve what we want to achieve? If we have no free will, there's no real way to do that. And if we have some free will, how much do we have? And then how do we actually use that free will to achieve our goals? And so this is why it's very important to understand the paradigm of this because especially as devotees, when we read a lot of these things, it's hard to tell what can I actually do to help myself? What can I actually do on my own? And then what is in Krishna's hands? What is in my karma's hand? And so on. And so the way Sankhya goes, it's one of the oldest philosophical traditions from a academic perspective, and it's essentially Vedanta, one may say at some point, because it's so ingrained in all the scriptures. For example, the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam both use the Sankhya philosophy as a foundation for defining a lot of things. And so it's definitely one of the oldest ones out there in just defining how things work. Um, and the way Sankhya works is that there are two irreducible entities. One is the Atman, which is the self. This is conscious, this is eternal, and it's changeless. And then there's Prakriti, which is matter. And this is unconscious and it changes. And so Atman has no psychological properties, but it's covered by some subtle Prakriti, which is like our mind, our intelligence, and ego. These three things are covering the real Atman, and they are the ones that are basically involving in the psychological properties in terms of thinking, willing, and so on. And so one might ask, who is the agent of action then? Since the self has no method of willing, who is the actual agent of action? Um, when we talk about changelessness in Sankhya, the way they talk about it is if something is eternal, then it cannot change. And if it can change, it is not eternal. That's how it goes. And the self's nature cannot change. And so free will and agency can only belong to the other part of it. It can belong to Atman because having a will, having agency means to change. You can change your mind. That's what will means. Free will means, rather. You can change your mind. You can change your desires. So it's not part of this. It's not part of the self, but rather it's part of the prakriti side or the matter side, which is our mind, our intelligence, our false ego, as one might say. And so this is where things get a little precarious. So now, who is the agent of action? If it's prakriti that's able to do these psychological things, um, agency requires the potential to make choices and to change one choice, and so it cannot be part of this change of self. And then to be an agent means to produce an action, which entails the agent understanding some internal change, or it's mixing with other entities and then also changing. So if you want to act, you either need to change yourself or you mix with something else and then you both change. Um, and this is very intuitive. For example, if I want to walk somewhere, I'm walking. I'm no longer sitting. And if I want to like do so, if I want to stay sitting, but then I like, let's say I mix with some other entity, I eat some food. Even though I haven't moved from my position, I might be changeless in that sense. Now I'm eating food. So my body has changed. We've mixed together, we've changed. And so all action happens in the Prakriti sphere. And so the obvious question comes, if I am not an agent, I meaning the soul is not an agent, then how can someone determine I will perform something good, I won't do something bad? Where does morality come into this? Where does religion even come into this? And then Sankhya, what it does is it assigns this all to the intelligence. And so the ego, the false ego, is the agent, not the actual self. And sometimes people say buddhi or intelligence is the agent instead of the ego. So there's many different ways of thinking about where the agent is. Um, but the main idea is that the source of action is prakriti or matter. The source of action is like our hand. That's what we're basically saying. Or the source of action is our intelligence. The source of action is our mind and or our ego and so on. And so there's many objections to this from many other schools of thought. Um, and then the main counter, like, of course, these are the objections. Like, clearly, I'm able to feel happy and sad. Clearly, I'm able to will in some way. Um, how can you reconcile that if it's all just coming from matter? And so the main counter argument that Sankhya gives is that if these were actually qualities of the self, then liberation would not be possible. As how can you let go of your inherent qualities? If my inherent quality is to to will in a certain way or to think and so on, to enjoy, the version of liberation in Sankhya does not have that. And so how can that reconcile? And so that's kind of the way they go about it. And then secondly, they use this scripture, this text that we read today, where if one thinks of themselves as a doer, they are deluded by ego. And so this is their idea, where actually the self is not the doer, it's just the ego. Now, the objections that are much harder for Sankhya to reconcile are that how can something like Prakriti, which is matter, which is unconscious and acts like mechanically, how can that be an agent? What we talked about was agent has the ability to reflect, choose, to determine action in some way. That goes with agency. And so what Sankhya says is that Prakriti just functions for the sake of the Purusha. It's just there for the sake of it. Like for example, like milk, it functions for the nourishment of the calf. That's the only reason milk exists. It's just there to nourish the calf or the human or whatnot. And so Prakriti acts spontaneously due to the proximity of the Purusha. Because my mind and my intelligence are in me, they're acting spontaneously with no direction to support me and to help my thoughts and to help provide thoughts and so on. And so the climax of all this is that no one is conditioned, no one is bound, and also no one's liberated. Only Prakriti transmigrates, this idea of matter, the subtle body that we might have, the gross body, and so on. Only that is bound to us, and only that is released. What we are is changeless, and we stay there. And so the essentially the self is always liberated, and it's only Prakriti that's the issue. And if matter is the agent, and then the self is the enjoyer, then the self faces the karma of someone else or something else because oh, my mind and body are doing stuff, but why am I facing the karma for it? And so the way they talk about it is that, oh, sometimes the non-agent can be the experiencer of results. For example, a cook may make the food but someone else eats it. And so in the same way, because they're very nearby in this sense, they're in the same body vicinity. What the mind body does is actually the results are experienced by the self in terms of karma. And so the final question is, what even is proximity? What does that mean? How can something that is like Atman or like the self, which is like omnipresent, infinite, how can it even have spatial geography? How does that get defined? What is the actual definition of it? The way they talk about it is through consciousness. And so this nearness is defined by like suitability, where the Purusha or the self, it possesses this potential of enjoying. It's meant to be enjoying, and then as a subject. And then there's the mind and intelligence and this whole mind body complex that has the potential of being enjoyed. And so it's meant to be used, and then the self is the user. They have some suitability here. It's a relationship that's built. But the thing is, then how do they actually interact? which comes into a bunch of different issues. And so the final reconciliation of Sankhya is that actually the self is some kind of passive agent. It incites action simply by just mere proximity to the self, and so that to matter. It's like a magnet. There's metal, and then there's a magnet. A magnet, just by being near to the metal, attracts the metal, but it's not actually doing any action, as one might say. And so agency is that which sets in motion everything else that helps towards that action. And so in this case, the self is some kind of passive agent in this in terms of Sankhya. Um, Now, of course, all these different statements in the Bhagavad Gita verify this. They validate this. The verse we read today, for example, there are more verses. In the 13th chapter, it says that one who can see that all activities that are performed by the body, um, which is created in material nature, sees that the self does nothing, actually sees. So it's saying that someone who actually sees understands that all the activities are actually performed by the body. In chapter 5, Krishna says that the the jiva or the spirit soul is the master of this body, but he does not create any activities, nor does he induce anyone to act, nor does he even create his own fruits of action. All of this is enacted by material nature or this prakriti. And in the 18th chapter, Krishna talks about the five causes of action, and those are the place of action, which is the body, the performer, the various senses, the many different kinds of endeavor, and then ultimately the super soul. And so these are the five factors of action. And so whatever right or wrong action a man performs by their body, their mind, or their speech is caused by these five factors. And then what Krishna says is that if one thinks himself the only doer, not considering the five factors, is certainly not very intelligent and cannot see things as they are. And so the Purusha or the self that we have is not the doer, but it's actually the enjoyer. And this is again validated in 13th chapter by Krishna. The way the Gaudiya Vaishnavas reconcile this is that they build on Sankhya and take it to another level, where they actually introduce that Prakriti has no chance of being the agent, because it's a very hasty claim, as some of the acharyas say, because it's actually not possible for something that's unconscious to be an agent. Like it's not possible for your wood or your metal to be an agent. Agency means to have direct perception of the means to accomplish an act. And so this is a very interesting statement. Agency means having direct perception of the means to accomplish an act. Essentially, agency means that it has to be aware. It has to be cognizant of what even needs to be done to do the act. And then on top of that, it also needs to be it also needs to perceive the desire to act. It has to have a desire to act. It also has to have volition. And this can only occur in a conscious entity, not an unconscious entity. And so there's no way we can leave agency only to matter because it can't desire it. It's not conscious. And even though consciousness is imposed on it, let's say my consciousness is imposed on my whole body, it still does not mean that the agent is actually the body. Because we can just say the hand is carrying something, but actually I'm actually carrying the thing through the hand. And so the source of that action is not just the hand. It doesn't end there. You can go one step further. It actually comes from the self, some conscious entity. And so actually the jiva or the soul is the agent. And so because Sankhya is stuck with this eternal and changeless axiom that they have, it leads to all these questions that it's not really able to fully reconcile with what we actually intuitively perceive in ourselves. Now, the opposite of Sankhya was Nyaya, as I mentioned, and it tries to essentially go against it and say that it couples an unchanging soul as some substance with some separable changing qualities such as agency and other psychological properties like happiness, distress, enjoyment, pleasure, all that. Um, that's also part of the self. So everything is just part of the self. It's one combined location for all of it. What Gaudiya Vaishnavism does is that it takes both of these. It takes this idea of an eternal self from Sankhya that is changeless in a sense. And it also takes this idea that the self has desires, it has consciousness to the level where it can think and will and be an agent. It also has that part to it. But then it brings another part to it because it's bhakti yoga. And so the end result of bhakti yoga is to cultivate love for God. And the way we do that is by performing actions like hearing or chanting or serving and so on to achieve that final goal. And so bhakti is both the means and also the end. And so the soul's devotional state, it just continues in the liberated state. And this is a very important aspect of bhakti. And the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they hold that there is a connection between the devotee and the Lord. There's some relationship there that gets established by performing actions or devotional practice. The only way you can perform these actions is if you have some agency. This practice, a devotional practice, only has some usefulness if the soul is the agent of action. Because without agency, scripture is meaningless. It tells you to do this, to do this, to do that, to do this, and do that. How are you going to do it unless you have the ability to act? You need to have the ability to act, and that comes from the self. And so, affirming this agency is very important as a first step in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And so, the Bhagavad Gita, it closely resembles this very classical Sankhya where they reject self-agency. However, there are innate capacities of the self, like agency, um, to distinguish objects, the ability to experience pleasure, and these are all expressed while in the embodied state, which is what we are in, um, through our self's relationship with our mind-body complex. The mind-body complex, to explain a little bit more, is our subtle elements, which are our mind, intelligence, and false ego, and our gross elements, which make up our entire body. Along with that, of course, there are senses and organs and so on. And so in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there is an idea there. The self is changeless, as Sankhya says, but it also is an agent to some level because it has to get pure love of God. It has to be an agent in some way. And so what Jiva Goswami says is that there is an individual self that is real, eternal, and distinct from this absolute reality of Krishna. So there's an individual self that is real, eternal, but it's also distinct from God. It's not the exact same as God, but it's also the same as God because it's got very similar qualities. But the relationship between the two, between the soul and God, is beyond reason. And it's only known through scripture. And this is the idea of achintya, where it's unknown, it's inexplainable. And so the self has an inherent potential to act, to know, and to experience pleasure. And this is actualized through a body. Now, this is very important. So we have the self has potential. It's what we call quality potential. It has the potential to act. It has the potential to know. It has the potential to experience something, pleasure, distress, whatnot. But it's actualized. And what actualized means is that it becomes manifest through a body, some mind body complex. And that mind body can be material or spiritual. And then on top of that, Krishna, God, has powers or shaktis that are also real and eternal, and they are a part of him eternally. And so this Atman or ourself is also considered one of God's eternal um, potencies, as we say. And so this is how the self works in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And it's very intuitive. It's extremely intuitive because the self has this potential to act, know, and experience pleasure. We can feel that. And we can see that it actually happens through our body. And so this is a very intuitive definition, especially compared to Sankhya. But Jiva Goswami goes a little further, and there's a lot more to the characteristics of that self than just this. It's very detailed. And so I'm just going to read a passage um, that describes all the characteristics of the self. So it's a lot, but we're going to go through each of them one by one. And so the self is neither a god, nor a human, nor an animal, nor an immovable being, nor the body, nor the senses, nor the mind, nor the life there, not even the intelligence. That's a lot of things that the self is not. It is also not inert. That means it's not idle. It is not mutable. It means that it cannot be split and divided. And it is not awareness only. So it's not just a faculty of awareness. It's more than that. Now we'll learn about what it actually is. It's aware of itself. That's number one. It's self-luminous. So it illuminates on its own power. It has unchanging form. So this goes to that Sankhya idea where it's changeless. It always resides in its true nature. Another Sankhya idea here. It is conscious. This is very intuitive. And especially in Indian philosophy, extreme, this is like the first step. It pervades the entire body. So just this body, it pervades it. It is of the nature of consciousness and bliss. What this means is that it has a nature of knowledge and it also has a nature of bliss. Basically, its eternal nature is to be happy. It is referent of the word I. When I say I, I'm talking about the self, the Atman, the soul inside me. And then there is a different self in each body. It is indivisible. You can't break it apart, and it is eternally pure. Now, this is the last point. Furthermore, it has intrinsic characteristics of being an apprehender. Apprehender means someone that understands. So it's an understander or a knower, an agent, okay, and a qualitative experiencer. And by its own nature and at all times, it is an inherent part of the indwelling Lord, which is Paramatma. So it's an inherent part of him. We're going to go through all these one by one to really unpack them and understand what the self is. The reason we need to do this is that by understanding the self, we can then understand agency. What can the self do? How much can it act? How much ability does it have to act? And then secondly, free will. How much freedom does the self have? What limits its freedom? And so on. So the first point is the self is conscious and self-luminous. The idea behind this is that the mind-body complex that we have is illuminated by the self. It needs the self to function. If you just have a body, there's nothing in it. But once you bring in the self, it illuminates that body and allows it to function. And so the way it does that is the self infuses its consciousness into the mind body complex by its presence as a witness. And so this idea of a witness comes in. The self is a witness, but it also is more than that. It's not just a witness, it has the potential to know, to act, and to experience. But these can only happen when it's in contact with the mind body complex. And so the self has a potential, but the knowing, the acting, the experiencing all happens in our mind body complex. Srila Prabhupada, what he does a lot is that when he talks about this body in a lot of his translations, he's actually referring to the mind body complex because they're actually all material in the sense of Krishna consciousness, where the mind, the intelligence, the false ego, and all the gross parts of our body, the physical body itself, are all material. And so I'm saying mind body complex because that's more terminology that we use right now. But when Prabhupada talks about the body, it also actually refers to the entire mind body complex, which includes our mind. And so the idea is that the self is more than just a witness because um, we'll get into it because this previous passage that I read talked about many other characteristics of the self. But we know that it's conscious and it's self-illuminating. Next one is the self is immutable, which basically means unchanging. And this talks about the Satrupa, or this eternal aspect. Because it's a witness, it is different from whatever it witnesses, and it is unchanging. And so a self does not undergo modifications, as a modification would mean it's temporary. And so only our mind and our body are subject to transformation, to change, because the observer has to remain changeless to witness changes. If the observer is also changing, you can't witness changes. And so the various states of our life, like birth and death, are because of time. And these only belong to the body, not the self. And so it's like the analogy is like the moon. There are phases of the moon, but they don't actually affect the moon itself. The moon is the same. And then one might say, well, in order to perform actions, the self needs time because it performs them through this mind body apparatus. How does that work in the spiritual world? Because the spiritual world has no time. How can actions be performed there? And the way the acharyas describe this is that the spiritual world is still sequenced. It's just that time does not carry its destructive influence there. This idea of things ending doesn't happen in the spiritual world, but there is still a sequence, but it's fluid and it's unfixed. So it's not necessarily linear sequences, but it allows the expression of the self's agency in the spiritual world as well, and to perform actions in the spiritual world, because there is a sequence to everything there. And then one might ask, well, if the self is the agent in this case, how can it remain unchanged? Because that's another thing that Sankhya brought up. Like it has to stay, in order to stay unchangeable, it cannot be the agent, because an agent is always mixing in. Well, now comes the magnet analogy again. The magnet acts as an agent, change upon like a metal, but it didn't actually undergo any modification. The magnet's still the same. It just acted as an agent for something else to change. And so the self performs actions at like a distance, influencing whatever gets changed. And so this is how we can think of the self as unchanging, while being an agent. And then after liberation, the self still remains unchanged, but now instead of a material body, it identifies with a spiritual mind body complex. And that is eternal. This body, the spiritual body that we have, is now eternal. And this is actually mentioned in Narada's story of liberation, which he tells to Vyasadeva. He says that he was united with a pure body that is related to the Lord. Now, there's a very key word here. It's united, because there's a distinction between the self and the spiritual body. The unchanging agent is the self. It never changed, but now it's united with its pure spiritual body, or the Siddha Deha. And that is how it's able to act and perform these psychological these properties, these psychological properties of knowing, acting, and experiencing through a spiritual apparatus. And so the self still remains unchanging, even as an agent, through this explanation. Now, the self also has an inherent power of consciousness. This is where it goes into the Nyaya part of it, where Nyaya says all our psychological qualities like awareness, volition, happiness, distress, all of that is a part of the self. Um, and so it's an inherent part of the self. And so what Gaudiya Vaishnavism says is that it takes a little bit of that, but what it actually tries to say is that it just has the inherent power of consciousness. The self has the power to understand things as real and eternal. And only an entity with the power of apprehension or understanding can see. And this is said in the Bhagavatam, where the individual soul, bereft of Krishna consciousness, has many ideas and activities created in the mind by external energy. They have been existing from time immemorial. Sometimes they are manifest in the awakening state and in the dream state, but during deep sleep, unconsciousness, or trance, they disappear. A person who is liberated in this life can see all these things vividly. And so only an entity that has the power of understanding can see. And the seeing is different from just awareness because it's able to understand it. And the pure self that sees and understands the manifestations of the mind cannot be an action of the mind, as I was saying here, in deep sleep. This deep sleep is where the mind goes to sleep. All the material aspects of our mind body complex are asleep. Our mind, intelligence, ego, and our entire physical body is asleep in this deep sleep. But still, we still have knowledge of it. And so that object that we have a knowledge of cannot be the same as a subject. And so it's not an action of the mind to know. It's also the pure self that itself has the ability to know and be cognizant and be conscious. And so it goes back to that. The self is self-luminous. And so it has an inherent quality of consciousness. And this consciousness itself, and this consciousness itself is also applying to itself, where it's conscious of itself, and also external objects. So it's conscious of itself and everything else. This idea of jnana, to know, has three different meanings. One is to understand, to be aware, to experience, to know, and so on. Very common. The second one is it refers to that by which one knows an object. And so this is contentful. There's some content, which is jnana, which is disclosed to the subject. And then also jnana can mean who is the one that is being cognizant, or in whom there is cognition. And so jnana is also a subject that possesses content. And so this content idea is what really Gaudiya Vaishnava definition of self comes from, where it's all about understanding, not understanding, but rather it's this inherent quality of consciousness, of knowing both itself and also external objects. It cannot be just the mind, because when we go deep sleep, the mind is asleep, but we're still aware and seeing that as witness. And so that consciousness, that awareness, all that is inherently a part of our true self. This segues into another point. The self is referring to the word I. So this idea of I am, I do, I did, I go, and so on. This I is actually the self. And Jiva Goswami breaks this down into two different identities. There's something called aham bhava, which is an incorrect conception of ourselves, which is caused by a function of matter, which is false ego. So it's an incorrect conception of who we actually are. And there's aham artha, which is the correct conception of who we are. And so this is actually what refers to I. The object of I is the feeling or the sense of being an I. And so when we're focusing on the mind and body, this physical mind and body, it is called ahankar, because the feeling of being this focused mind and body is whatever this mind and body is. If I'm focusing on my height or my skin color, my gender, whatnot, that is who I become. My identity is what I focus on. And so I'm focusing on the physical side of it. My I is now this false ego, this ahankara. And this is actually different from ourselves because this false ego is a part of our mind body complex. In its pure state, though, it knows that the I actually is the real self, is aham artha, which is intrinsic to ourselves. And so, an axiom that Jiva Goswami brings up over here, or understanding this, is that there must be an ego in the very literal sense, ego meaning an identity, for there to be any apprehension. And apprehension here means to be any knowledge. And so there must be an ego for there to be any knowledge. For example, when we now talk about deep sleep, this is a very important one. When we say I slept well after deep sleep, it means that there was an inherent ability for knowledge, for apprehension, inherent feeling of happiness or distress, and there's an inherent sense of I. And so when the material ego is idle, our entire mind body complex is idle in this deep sleep. there must be a capacity within ourself that allows it to experience that. We're able to experience our deep sleep when everything else is non-functional. And so there is a self that remains without the mind. So it remembers the experience of sleep. And this comes from the spiritual ego. And the spiritual ego is active at that point, since the material ego is asleep. And so there's an innate sense of self that exists. And then one might say, how do we actually know we experience deep sleep instead of just inferring it? Like, oh, okay, I rested. It must have been like, I just woke up. It must have been very peaceful. I feel rested. I slept well. I just made an inference. What Jiva Goswami says is that one must have prior knowledge of cause and effect in order to make an inference. For example, if I were to infer that, oh, someone's cooking rice over there or some nice sabji by just the smell, it's because I know what that sabji smells like. I know what rice smells like. And so if I smell something, I'm like, I can infer, oh, that might be rice. But if we've never experienced this deep sleep because everything's asleep, how can an inference even be made? Sankhya talks about this to some level as well. It talks about these five mental fluctuations. One is correct cognition, false cognition, imagination, memory, and deep sleep. And so the first four are mental fluctuations. The last one, deep sleep, Sankhya says, is a lack of mental fluctuations. It's like saying the night is just, there's no sun. The sense of night is the non-existence of the sun. But Jiva Goswami, he goes back to that same point where if you are experiencing something, then there is some ego behind it. There's some identity that is experiencing that. And so what he says that in our waking, we're awake, both our egos are mixed. There's a spiritual ego, there's a material ego, they're mixed. But in deep sleep, only the spiritual ego allows for that experience, and it's absent from any mental fluctuation. And so there is an ego or an identity inherent within the self, and that is what I refer to as I. The self bestows this agency that it has inherently to matter because the self is absorbed in that matter in this body. And so you can't adopt a role in a drama or a play without having an identity before it. You're adopting something. You didn't start off as nothing. You started off as some person, you take a role, now you take that role with you. But it's not like you started off with nothing. And so in the same way, the self is another way of explaining that the self is actually an inherent identity. Krishna also talks about this, or not actually, not Krishna, I think. Not sure who talks about it, but it's in the Bhagavatam, 11th canto, where it says a worker free of attachment is in the mode of goodness. Okay, so a worker here means an agent. An agent free of attachment is in the mode of goodness. An agent blinded by personal desire is in the mode of passion. An agent who has completely forgotten how to tell right from wrong is in the mode of ignorance. But an agent who has taken shelter of me, Krishna, is understood to be is understood to be transcendental to the modes of nature. And so this sense of I is not a function of matter, but it's an inherent capacity present in the self. And then it uses the mind-body complex as an apparatus to essentially enact that idea of self, the idea of identity, and so on. And so the real self is the witness of everything. Another point that was made is the selves are multiple and indivisible. It's a very intuitive point. Many of us, each of us, have our own self, and then that self diffuses its consciousness throughout my entire body. And so this is a very common point. The self is atomic, essentially. It's limited to one body, one zone. And it's not this idea where everyone is a reflection of the same self and whatnot. Now, the last point is that the self is an apprehender. It's an agent. It's an experiencer. And essentially, what it's saying is that the self has the capacity to know. The mind-body complex is made of inert matter, but it acquires the power of agency or this ability to act when it has a relationship with the self. And the analogy given in the Bhagavatam is that as iron has the power to burn when made red hot in the association of fire, so the body, the senses, the living force, mind, and intelligence, although merely lumps of matter, can function in their activities when infused with a particle of consciousness. And so, as iron cannot burn unless heated by fire, the body cannot act unless favored by the Supreme Lord. The agency that appears to exist within our body is actually a characteristic of the true self. And so, agency is a part of our self, it's inherent. Heat and light are not innate properties of the iron. But when it's heated, it takes on those properties of fire. And so, the mind body complex that we have takes on the properties of our actual self. That's like the fire in this case. We go back to those five causes of action that Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad Gita, where the location, which is the body, the agent, in this case, the connector between the self and inert matter, which is called the ego, the false ego, and then the various means, which are the sense organs, the various endeavors, which are the movements of our life airs, and then fate, or this immanent being, the inner force of all, who in this case, the super soul. And so the agent is a false ego, which has two contributing causes. One, as we just talked about, the innate capacity of the self for agency. So we have an innate capacity to be an agent. And then also the second contributing cause is the mind-body complex through which that agency is enacted. And so agent refers to the self. This is said in Srimad Bhagavatam by Kapila Dev as well. The cause of the conditioned soul's material body and senses, and the senses presiding deities, the demigods, is the material nature. The cause of all that is material nature. This is understood by learned men. The feelings of happiness and distress of the soul, who is transcendental by nature, are caused by the spirit soul himself. So self is the original cause of agency, and it infuses agency in matter. But then how do we reconcile the other points of Bhagavad Gita, where it says the self is not an agent, the self is not the doer? As we just read in the verse at the beginning, the spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are actually carried out by material nature. And so, who is actually the doer? Well, is matter the doer? Um, what is actually going on over here? And so, what Jiva Goswami says is that it is the embodied self, the jiva, which is basically our pure self connected to a mind body complex that is talking about over here. That's the thing that's bewildered. The spirit soul reference here is not our pure self, but rather the embodied self, because it has a false ego. So it has to be the embodied self. And so this embodied self has the ability to think because it's able to think, oh, I'm the doer. In order to think that you're the doer, you must carry some agency. But this thinker is deluded because that thinker thinks he acts independently. Now, this is where we're getting to the climax of this all. Krishna says that the spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities. But actually, what he's trying to say is that it's not that he is the independent doer of activities. Krishna clarifies this in 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where he says that, therefore, anyone who thinks himself the only doer, not considering all the five factors, as I mentioned up there, is certainly not very intelligent and cannot see things as they are. And so, in the statement here in chapter 3, it's not denying the agency of the jiva, but rather it is mentioning that it is not independent. There are two constraining factors, or not there are two other influences. One is matter that influences it, and the second is Krishna's oversight. To even be able to think and identify oneself as their mind-body complex requires some agency, as I just said. And so the self used its innate agency to identify with the body. There's an inherent agency within us. We use that to identify as the doer, but the self does not have independent agency. And so this is a very important point. The self is a part of the super soul. or the immanent Lord, which is Paramatma. But this is not the same as Bhagavan. Bhagavan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is different from Paramatma. But this Paramatma exists and operates within us. And Paramatma has dominion over the entire physical world. And it resides in every single body of all living entities. And it's also um, the source of our of our nature. The living entity, the soul, is a part of the energy of the Lord. Mamaevam Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanadana, where these living entities are eternal fragmental parts of Krishna in this sense. And so now we've understood the self. We've understood all the different aspects of selfhood. Let's get to the crux of it. So we understand agency somewhat. The self has an innate sense of agency, but there are also other factors that limit that agency, like matter and then also the Supreme Lord. And so, what is free will? How does free will interact with the supremacy of God? Jiva Goswami, to talk about this, he brings up three terms, and these are three types of agents. There's the simple agent, which is independent. There's a causative agent, which is an agent that causes another thing or person to perform an action. And then thirdly, there's an agent under the control of a causative agent and is the one who is made to perform an action. Excuse me. The self, one may say, to begin with, is a causative agent, as it initiates an action in the mind-body complex, and then the mind-body complex takes care of executing that action. And so it causes it to perform the action. And the self is free in doing so. But these actions are approved by the Lord, since the Lord is also a causative agent. The Lord, by definition, is a causative agent universally. And so he gives sanction to this action. In the 13th chapter, Krishna says, "Yet in this body there is another transcendental enjoyer who is the Lord, the supreme proprietor, who exists as the overseer and permitter, and who is known as the super soul." And so the self cannot be a simple agent. It's not independent because there is an overseer. There's someone approving their actions. The Lord, however, is the causative agent, but also the simple agent because he is independent. He's unbounded by time, karma, and all these other limiting factors. And so the self is actually the agent under the control of the causative agent. So it's not even a causative agent on its own necessarily, but it's actually under the control of the causative agent too. It can be two types of agents. And the way the self is limited, I think I'm running out of charge. I'll need to just get a charger. The way the self is limited is in two ways. One, it's limited by its karma, which are its past consequences that it still needs to face. And the second limiting factor are its samskars, or latent memories, impressions from previous lives. And so our free will is reined in a sense because there's karma from our previous lives and so on, but there's also our samskars and our previous latent impressions. Hare Krishna, am I lagging?
Yeah, you
Can you
lagged,
all hear me?
you lagged kind of maybe some 10-15 seconds like that.
Okay, I'll just repeat my point.
Yeah, sure. And are you sharing anything slides or you're just speaking?
No, I'm just speaking.
Or just speaking? Yeah, continue. Please go ahead.
Okay, so what I was saying was that the self's independence or free will is hampered by its karma and its past impressions. And what's very interesting here is that Jiva Goswami says that these are very difficult. They create tendencies that are very difficult to control. They cure tendencies towards particular kinds of actions. And so our free will is not so free in the sense, in the embodied state, where we have this karma, where we have these impressions and so on. And so the conclusion of all this is that Gaudiya Vaishnavas essentially accept an individual eternal self. That's from Sankhya. And then they also take some aspects from Nyaya, that the self possesses latent powers of agency, of knowledge, of experiences, and so on. And they also proceed further to argue that these latent capacities of knowledge, awareness, agency, experiences, and so on, in order to be manifest, they must have access to a body. And so they need a mind body complex for expression. So that's very interesting as well. The self on its own has no facility to express, it has the potential to express and to act and to know. But without a mind body complex, it has no facility to do that. And it needs that both in this world and even in the spiritual world. Agency. So it inherently can know and it inherently can also act. And then to describe agency, there are four possible states, as is mentioned in the scriptures. Four possible states for different kinds of environments. First is agency in our embodied state. So we're in this material world, we're conditioned, and we're acting under Maya. Then our agency is expressed through a material mind body complex, which is itself under the oversight of Krishna. And the way it's under the oversight of Krishna is that's a whole different kind of conversation there, because the way Krishna um, oversees it is by being in within us as Paramatma. And in fact, he's like an order carrier where we desire and then those get translated to actions. But the only way our desire becomes an action is if we qualify for it. And that qualification comes in from our past karma, which allows us to have a particular kind of body. For example, I cannot fly. I'm not a bird. Even if I may desire to fly, I will never fly. As hard as I flap my arms. And in the same way, a bird may not be able to swim as hard as it tries because of its karma. And so that's how Krishna oversees our desires, or rather our agency in a sense, by being Paramatma and by being this connection between our desire and then actually how matter moves according to it. Now, the other state is that one is in the material world, but they're acting in service of Krishna. And so now here, agency is expressed again, same through the mind body complex, but the agency is a form of Krishna's own internal power, his own chit shakti, which is his power of knowledge and cognizance. And so it is now coming from Krishna's own potencies, this agency, when one is acting in the service of Krishna. And then number three, agency in the state where someone identifies with Brahman. Someone's merged into Brahman. What does agency look like for them? It basically remains unutilized as some potential quality potential. It has the potential to act, to express, to know, to experience, but it's unutilized because it's in Brahman. And then agency in the spiritual world in Vaikuntha and Goloka Vrindavan is expressed in and also through a perfected body, which is the Siddha Deha. And so this distinction between material and spiritual ego is very important. Material ego causes the self to identify with a temporary mind-body complex, but it still relies on the spiritual ego behind it. And so this is a very comprehensive kind of study of what our free will is, what is our agency, our ability to act, and what limits it on a grand scale. Why do we feel like sometimes we don't have free will? And so under these different states of existence, where we're in the material world under Maya or in the service of Krishna and so on, our agency is expressed in many different ways. And so right now I'll be very happy to take any questions anyone might have or reflections from this conversation or this discussion rather. I didn't really converse with any of you, more of a
Anyone in
monologue.
the Zoom call, if they have any question, please ask this learned speaker. I think he has chosen a very, very difficult topic. It's not an easy topic. Actually, what he has chosen, a very difficult topic, my thinking is probably if he had used slides, it would have been better expressed, but still could have been a difficult topic. I think even if he had used slides, it's an extremely difficult topic, and at the level of discussed in Brahma Sutra, Vedanta is at that level. It's highly intellectual topic actually. But yes, anyone has any question, please go ahead.
Thank you for the feedback as well.
Yeah. What I understood towards the end, I think you summarized it, is at a very high level is we do have free will at different levels basically. So there is a free will of um, soul has free will. It is expressed through the mind and intelligence, but then whether that will translate to something substantial, tangible, it depends on the agency of the super soul. uh, his permission is required. So in that sense, we that our relationship with Krishna, as an unfortunately thinking has our order carrier, is the agency we have basically, but still he reserves the right. Certain things are completely illegal basically, in the sense like the example you gave. If you're a bird, you cannot swim. If you're a human, you cannot fly like that. Those are reserved by the super soul, that what is allowed and what is not allowed. But if you're doing something wrong as a human body, he'll probably not going to stop you. He will give you a sense of hesitation in your mind. That he will do, because that agency he has over your mind uh, as well. Just like soul has agency over his mind, super soul also has his. Because remember, in what I think in 13th chapter, Krishna says, "I am the knower of all bodies," and that includes their minds also, right? So he has agency over. So he gives that sense of hesitation. But if still you are determined to do something wrong, uh, he helping is not the right word, but he lets you do it basically, in the
It
sense.
facilitates it, yeah.
Yeah, he still facilitates that. And I think in Bhagavatam, somewhere in the, I'm forgetting the which chapter, which is canto and all, but Kausi Taki Upanishad, it is written that if you want to go to hell, super soul will help you, and if you want to go to heaven, super soul will help you. It's a very simplistic statement, but that's what they meant. It meant that even if you want to do something wrong, Lord facilitates you, but He does give you. It just puts the seed of hesitation in you. Anything, that first seed of hesitation that comes, right, when you want to do something wrong, it actually comes from super soul. Um, so that's how I understood it. Anyone else, please, please feel free to unmute. And while I go to online and see in Facebook or YouTube, anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask questions, reflections.
Thank you for that first that reflection that you said. I think it's a very great way of of summarizing it as well. And I think what's amazing, well, what I from when I looked into this, is that when we serve the Lord and we're serving Krishna, that agency is provided by himself. Our ability to act comes from Krishna's own spiritual internal potency, which I think is so interesting, that those that are liberated, the Jivan Muktas is what it says, is that uh, and they have their ability to act comes from Krishna. They're not limited in the same ways that someone like me is under the influence of Maya. And so that's also a very interesting thing. And then also in terms of the order carrier point, Prabhupada, what he says is that this is proof that Paramatma cannot be God. He's not Bhagavan, because Krishna is not just an order carrier. He's the Supreme Lord. And so that's another very important point with that. And so this connection between, I would say, like the self and then the mind body complex is that Paramatma.
Yeah, yeah. Anyone has any question? Let me just
Mm.
unmute time.
Hare Krishna. I just want to
Hare
thank
Krishna
you
Prabhu.
for such an amazing scholarly presentation. I could join on and off, but yeah, I definitely enjoyed because I wanted to edify myself with such a knowledge. And one thing I'm just curious to know what inspired you to take such a amazing topic to get more details about these technical things.
Once I asked Maharaj on UTM, um, what exactly is free will if God knows everything? And he was like, read this book. And then he gave me a book. And so then I read it, and then now I'm trying to, I, in order to learn it myself, I tried to make a presentation out of it, and share it with all of you, because I found it very fascinating. I think I think it was just very helpful in knowing like what we can actually do and what limits us. And what I found the most interesting was that our self has an innate quality of being an agent, which I feel like is very intuitive, but it can get hidden with all these verses that we read, like we're not the doer and whatnot. But actually, it's that we're not the only doer, but there's still a good amount of agency and responsibility that does fall on us. And that's very important because when we think about doing bhakti or devotional practices, one might say, "Oh, it's like my life is just going in disarray right now. I don't have this is not in my destiny to do it right now." Or one might say, "This is just not possible for me," or whatnot. But when we go deeper into it, we understand where the source of action comes from. There is definitely something that's limiting it, but when in the service of Krishna, that agency is fully provided by him. And so there's no excuse to not have those desires because those desires still have a lot of value. And so that's what I liked about researching it, especially because there's so much more to just because action is everything. That's our whole practice. And so if we understand how action works on a technical level, it can help us uh, be be better devotees in a sense, be better practitioners of bhakti.
And also limitations, know our limitations.
And to know exactly like
The
these
kind of
samskaras and karma and so on,
correct,
it's
the kind of
it's what
body you
limits
are.
us. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
if the devotee is in Maharloka or Janaloka, he can take any form. He can fly anywhere. Although he may
Right.
be some kind of human-looking body, although not human body, right? They can do anything because they are is the same soul, and that shows
Mhm.
that it actually shows that the soul has agency. If soul did not have agency, why would soul think he knows he's in human body? Why would he ever think that he can fly? Why would he ever think that he can swim? Because in some
Exactly.
body it is possible, basically.
Exactly. It's very intuitive as well, this idea of agency. Very, very intuitive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I think Prabhu, you're on mute.
Yeah, the quick question I had, like, so even by performing devotional services, that field of activity can be expanded, or it always remain the same, like whatever limitations or whatever it can it be overcome?
What do you mean by limitations over here?
Means whatever was destined, like whatever was supposed to be there, but by performing bhakti, we can overcome some of the limitations or anything that was blocking us.
So the limitations that are mentioned are there are two. There's past samskaras and then there's karma. And so the language that Jiva Goswami uses is very, very important. He says that it creates tendencies that are extremely strong to perform certain types of actions. And so, yeah, of course you can overcome. It's not like it's impossible to overcome, but it's extremely strong forces. And when it comes to karma, for example, there are certain things that we are meant to experience in a life. There's certain impressions. For example, Hridayananda says like if I'm afraid of like heights, it's probably because I fell off a cliff in a previous life. And if I'm afraid of snakes, it's probably because I got bit by a snake. These impressions, they go through our different lives. These samskars are built by how we've died and how we've felt pain in previous lives, even how we felt pleasure in previous lives. And so those are very hard to go away. It's just because now I'm a devotee, I'm not scared of heights. Extremely unreasonable kind of way of thinking about it, because that's just a part of it's a very strong part of my I can still overcome that fear, with the right kind of practice. But really, devotional practice is once we know that these are things that are limiting us and we have to just work around them, that's what's important. Prabhupada, in one of his purports to Gajendra in the when he's getting bit by the crocodile, he says that one shouldn't try to make their life very hard, when because they're already fighting against Maya. We're already on this. We're waging a war against Maya. Like, at least, be Gajendra on land. Don't be Gajendra in water if you don't need to. And so, in the same way, when we know that these are our limitations, we are able to engineer our life in a way where we're still able to do our Krishna conscious practice without letting them really being the biggest hindrance. So we take care of them on a very practical level so that we can get out of here as soon as possible. And in terms of it going away, um, Sri Baldev Vidyabhushan, he says that because it says Krishna, when you do bhakti, your karma's gone immediately. But he's like, this immediate is actually just like you still have a life to finish it off. And so your karma will last the rest of your life. But if that's your last life here, then that's your last life here. Then your karma is gone. And so even though you become a devotee, it says immediately, it's really immediate in the sense of your time immemorial. You've been passing through trillions of lifetimes. So like one lifetime is basically immediate. And so that's kind of how that goes as well.
It's relative actually.
Yeah, Haribol. Thank you, bro. Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Very, very
We're
excellent.
running out of time. Yes.
Excellent
Thank
talk.
you, Braja-rasa Bhavana. It was a very difficult topic, so I think I have to listen a couple of times to understand it, but it was a very
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful
Try to
process.
make some slides. I will suggest try to make some slides, and maybe
I
break
can
it
share my
down.
notes real quick. Maybe I don't have
Yeah.
time to make slides, unfortunately. I would have loved to make slides because I know it's really, really helpful. But I have some notes for all of you if you want to take a look in the
Okay.
future. Or this is the book.
What
I
is the
don't
name of the book?
what my topic was: free will, agency, and selfhood in Indian philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the name of the lecture today also. So from there you
Yeah.
can get the title. Anyone else?
Written by, who wrote this book?
Advaita Prabhu, who's a professor of Indology and religion in Rutgers University. And so
Oh,
he's also written a book on Yoga Sutras, Patanjali.
mhm.
And so he collaborated with a lot of authors to write this book, many different Indian thoughts and so on in here. I only covered just the Gaudiya Vaishnava part.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
nice.
Thank you, Braja-rasa Bhavana.
Thank you.
Very nice. We are out of time. It's 6 minutes past, but excellent topic, and that's why everyone was excited to share their feedback and ask questions. Thank you, brothers Bhavana Prabhu. Again, we will close the session. Vancha kalpatarum vashinam pranam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo
Vaishnavebhyo namo namo.
ब्रजरस भावना प्रभु की जय श्री
Jai
जय
ki jai. Haribol.
all bhaktavinder ki jai. Thank you, dear devotees, for taking time from your busy lives and coming to this online only class. We also have class on Saturday morning and in Sunday evening. Please do come. That is, on site means you can come to the temple and listen to the class. And again, next Wednesday we'll have online only class. Thank you again. Hari Bol. We'll close the session now.